The turning point in the skies over Britain and this alternate version of 1940, the air war over Britain unfolds with a level of precision and discipline that transforms the conflict into a decisive German triumph. Instead of dispersing their efforts or shifting toward retaliatory bombing campaigns, the Luftwaffe maintains a cold, calculated focus on erasing every element that provides the Royal Air Force with operational structure. German commanders, drawing on lessons from the early Blitzkrieg victories, commit to a relentless schedule of strikes aimed at crippling detection, coordination, and aircraft production. Radar stations along the southern and eastern coasts, normally the RF's critical early warning backbone, are attacked with persistence until the entire chain collapses. Without these stations, Fighter Command loses the ability to track incoming formations, forcing squadrons into blind guessing and delayed responses that drain fuel, time, and confidence. Airfields soon become the second layer of destruction. The Luftwaffe targets runways, fuel depots, maintenance hangars, and communication centers with methodical repetition. Hurricanes and Spitfires are damaged faster than engineers can repair them, and many fighters never take off again. Pilots scramble from one makeshift base to another, often landing in fields converted into improvised strips, only to find minimal supplies and no replacement parts. Even experienced aces, usually capable of shifting the balance in tight engagements, find themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of sorties Germany launches each day. Exhaustion becomes as dangerous as enemy fire. Factories producing engines, propellers, and airframes are bombed without interruption. Skilled workers cannot keep pace with the destruction, and management struggles to rebuild assembly lines that once ran with astonishing efficiency. New aircraft roll out in dwindling numbers, a sharp contrast to Germany's stable industrial output. Fighter Command's reserves shrink to alarming levels, and commanders face the grim reality that every lost aircraft now has a permanent consequence. Civilian morale also begins to fracture, not because German bombers strike cities indiscriminately, but because the population senses a tightening noose. The absence of RAF interception creates an atmosphere of helplessness. Columns of German aircraft fly across the channel unchallenged, creating a psychological pressure greater than the physical damage they inflict. Newspapers, already strained by censorship and fear of spreading panic, struggle to maintain the illusion of resilience. Rumors spread that the government cannot protect the coast. Rural areas, previously untouched by war, now hear the constant drone of engines overhead, a reminder that no region lies beyond reach. This shift in air dominance transforms the strategic character of the conflict. British commanders had always believed that the RAF could endure long enough to force Germany into abandoning the campaign, but the numbers begin to tell a different story. Each week brings fewer available fighters, fewer trained pilots, fewer functioning bases. Weather delays no longer offer relief. German operations adjust quickly, filling clear skies with bombers and fighters that operate with growing confidence. As British defenses crumble, the perception of inevitability grows. Diplomats across Europe observe the rapid degradation of Britain's last protective layer, and some quietly conclude that the island nation cannot survive the coming storm. The apparent collapse of British air power signals not merely a military defeat, but a shift in the geopolitical balance that observers understand immediately. The fall of the RAF becomes the central moment in which Britain's fate changes course, an unmistakable break from the resilience that once defined the island's defense. Operation Sea Lion and the fall of the British Isles. Once the Luftwaffe secures uncontested control of the skies, Germany initiates Operation Sea Lion with a precision that catches British planners off guard. The invasion begins before dawn, when transport aircraft release waves of airborne units across the southern counties. These paratroopers descend near rail junctions, coastal artillery batteries, and telecommunications nodes, severing links that the British Army relies on for coordination. Many command posts lose contact with regional units within hours, forcing officers to make decisions based on incomplete information. This initial disruption proves critical, creating gaps that German ground forces exploit almost immediately. Across the English Channel, a massive flotilla of barges, support ships, and escort vessels begins crossing under the umbrella of continuous Luftwaffe patrols. The Royal Navy attempts to intervene, but without air cover, the effort becomes disastrous. Every sortie is met by relentless dive-bombing runs that tear through destroyers and cruisers with ruthless efficiency. Ships attempting to rescue survivors face the same fate, turning the channel into an expanse of burning oil and shattered hulls. Despite the courage of British sailors, the losses mount too quickly, forcing the Admiralty to withdraw surviving vessels to preserve what remains of the fleet. On the beaches of Kent and Sussex, British defenders fight fiercely, but the invading force is too large and too well supported. German artillery quickly establishes control over the landing zones, and armored vehicles, brought ashore on specially modified barges, push inland with unexpected speed. British battalions attempt, yet the absence of reliable communication and the constant threat from enemy aircraft make coordinated resistance nearly impossible. As the German advance expands, London becomes the central target. Roads leading into the capital clog with civilians fleeing the fighting, creating massive bottlenecks that hinder military movement. German paratroopers seize key bridges and government buildings, prompting the cabinet to relocate repeatedly in an attempt to remain operational. Churchill broadcasts appeals for defiance, but many units never hear his messages due to the collapse of national communication lines. The fall of the capital becomes less a battle and more a disintegration of structure. German troops secure districts block by block, encountering sporadic pockets of resistance but little organized defense. Fires break out across the city, not from aerial bombardment but from urban combat and sabotage by retreating forces. By the time the last coordinated British formations withdraw toward the Midlands, the government recognizes that continued resistance from the island itself is unsustainable. In desperation, surviving officials and members of the royal family evacuate to Canada, establishing an emergency government in exile. Their departure creates a political vacuum that several influential British figures attempt to exploit. Some advocate for continued resistance, while others argue for negotiating terms to prevent further bloodshed. Factions within Parliament fractured, frightened, and scatter abate the possibility of an armistice even as German forces advance deeper into the country. The occupation begins quickly in southern England. German administrators arrive alongside military units, imposing strict curfews and securing supply lines. Collaborators surface almost immediately, motivated by survival or personal ambition, offering assistance to the new authorities. These individuals help establish an interim governance structure that gives Germany the means to stabilize the region while organizing further operations. By early 1941, the British Isles can no longer sustain organized resistance. Exhausted, cut off from allies, and deprived of air and naval power, the nation issues a formal capitulation. Across Europe, governments react with disbelief as the one country that defied Hitler the longest finally falls. The perception of German invincibility solidifies, and the balance of power on the continent shifts permanently. For Hitler, the victory marks the moment his ambitions for total control of Western Europe become reality. The political transformation of Europe and the end of Churchill's legacy, Britain's collapse triggers a political earthquake, rippling across the continent, reshaping governments, alliances, and national identities in ways that no European leader had anticipated. Once London falls and the Union Jack is lowered across official institutions, a profound vacuum emerges in the geopolitical structure of Europe. The absence of Britain, own major power that had persisted in resisting Hitler, destroys any illusion that democratic states can stand against the Reich without overwhelming support. Nations that once counted on British resolve for moral or strategic strength now scrambled to redefine their futures in a Europe dominated by authoritarian power. Germany wastes no time constructing a new order. In London, a hand-picked civilian administration is installed, carefully selected for its willingness to cooperate and its ability to present a facade of legitimacy. This regime operates under strict oversight, functioning less as a government and more as a conduit for German directives. One of its first acts is recognizing German supremacy throughout Europe, formally ending any British claimed influence over continental affairs. Having lost both military capability and governmental stability, the British Empire begins unraveling almost immediately. Colonial officials find themselves isolated and uncertain. An independence movement sense that the former imperial center can no longer enforce authority. India becomes the most prominent example, as political organizations seize the moment to demand concessions that London, now powerless, cannot negotiate or resist. With Britain eliminated as a counterbalance, other European nations re-evaluate their positions. Franco's Spain, previously cautious in its dealings with the Axis due to fear of British retaliation, now shifts decisively toward open collaboration. Access to ports, logistical pathways, and intelligence becomes available to Germany in exchange for guarantees supporting Franco's grip on power. Neutral states like Sweden and Switzerland, having relied on diplomatic ambiguity, move to adopt policies that either directly benefit the Reich or avoid any risk of provoking it. Economic agreements, resource arrangements, and trade concessions are implemented to ensure survival under the shadow of expanding German dominance. Even regions that maintain nominal independence find themselves tethered to Berlin's influence. Governments censor dissent, modify laws, and restructure internal security mechanisms to align with German expectations. The political culture of the continent begins to shift as authoritarian norms spread, pressuring smaller states to conform or face potential intervention. The idea of democratic Europe quietly dissolves, replaced by a system where compliance becomes the foundation of stability. Meanwhile, Churchill's government in exile operates from Canada with limited means and shrinking authority. Despite Churchill's powerful rhetoric and enduring reputation, his capacity to influence events diminishes with each passing month. Without an industrial base, a functioning navy, or territorial sovereignty, the exile administration becomes symbolic rather than strategic. Attempts to coordinate resistance across occupied Europe struggle to gain momentum. Underground groups admired Churchill, but admiration offers little practical assistance against the security network reinforced by German intelligence and collaborators. In the British Isles themselves, scattered groups attempt to undermine the occupation, but their efforts encounter overwhelming force. Surveillance expands rapidly, and even minor acts of defiance lead to severe reprisals. German rule becomes embedded in daily life, making organized resistance increasingly difficult. Over time, Churchill's image morphs from wartime leader to exiled vision, quoted, respected, but ultimately sidelined by circumstances beyond his command. His legacy, once defined by his unyielding stance against tyranny, becomes marked by tragedy. He remains a symbol of defiance, yet holds no platform from which to shape the continent's future. In this new political order, Europe has moved on without him, reshaped by forces that his defiance could no longer counter. The global ripple effect, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the New World Order. The collapse of Britain reverberates across the world with a force unmatched by any previous geopolitical disaster. In the United States, the shock is immediate and profound. For decades, Britain had been America's cultural sibling, diplomatic partner, and strategic buffer against totalitarian influence in Europe. With the Union Jack lord over London and a German occupation authority in control, President Franklin D. Roosevelt faces the most volatile political divide of his lifetime. Isolationists, emboldened by the British defeat, dominate public discourse. They argue that Europe has already lost to fascism and that American lives should not be sacrificed to liberate a continent unwilling or unable to defend itself. The America First Committee grows to unprecedented power, pushing for strict continental defense and complete disengagement from European affairs. Roosevelt, aware of the growing threat posed by a triumphant Nazi empire, attempts to warn Congress that a German-dominated Europe would eventually transform the Atlantic into a front line, but without Britain as a staging ground, any future military campaign becomes vastly more difficult, logistically and politically. While American politicians argue Hitler seizes the moment he had long awaited. With the Western Front secure and no British bombing campaigns threatening German industry, preparations for Operation Barbarossa intensify. The Wehrmacht deploys hundreds of thousands of additional troops to the east, along with armor and aircraft that would have otherwise been tied up defending Western Europe. When the invasion of the Soviet Union begins in June 1941, it is conducted with overwhelming force. In this timeline, the Soviet Union faces an even more catastrophic beginning. The Luftwaffe swiftly destroys most Soviet air power, and German armored spearheads advance at a pace that stuns even their own generals. Kyushu falls earlier. Smolensk collapses without the prolonged resistance seen in our timeline. By the autumn of 1941, German forces reach the outskirts of Moscow with nearly intact supply lines and a reinforced army. The capital falls before winter fully sets in, creating a psychological shock that reverberates from Washington to Tokyo. Stalin refuses to surrender and relocates his government beyond the Urals, but the symbolic loss of Moscow fractures Soviet morale and weakens centralized control over vast regions. Japan observes these seismic shifts with intense interest. Instead of facing a world where Germany is contained or pressured by Western powers, Tokyo now sees a Europe fully under Axis domination. Confident that the United States will hesitate to enter a war without allies, Japan accelerates its expansion into Southeast Asia with Germany's indirect support. Tokyo pushes deeper into the resource-rich territories of the Pacific, calculating that even if conflict with the United States becomes inevitable, the global balance now favors the Axis. Japan may even reconsider its Pearl Harbor strategy, focusing instead on isolating American power in Asia while avoiding a full-scale confrontation. The result is a world rapidly reorganizing itself around authoritarian dominance. Democracies shrink in influence, pushed into defensive postures across the Atlantic and Pacific. The fall of Britain does not simply shift the balance of power, it shatters it, creating a vacuum filled by ambitious regimes whose expansionist visions now seem achievable. The New World Order takes shape, not through diplomacy or treaties, but through the collapse of the last bastion of resistance in Western Europe and the unstoppable advance of fascist and militarist empires. A world rewritten, the long-term outcome of a German victory by the mid-1940s, the world has fully reshaped itself around a new and chilling geopolitical reality. With Europe firmly under its control, Nazi Germany emerges as the unrivaled superpower of the Eastern Hemisphere. The territories conquered during the war, stretching from the Atlantic coast to the outskirts of the Ural Mountains, formed the backbone of a vast imperial system. German administrative regions, puppet governments, and collaborationist regimes function in rigid coordination, creating a continent unified not by diplomacy, but by fear and military domination. Britain, once the beating heart of global democracy, exists only as a shadow of its former self. The British Empire collapses rapidly, and independence movements sweep across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, accelerated not by moral awakening but by London's inability to project power. The Royal Navy is broken apart, with many vessels absorbed into the Kriegs. London, transformed into the headquarters of a German-controlled governing council, is surrounded by constant surveillance, curfews, and ideological oversight. Small resistance groups attempt to operate in the shadows, but the Gestapo's reach is overwhelming. Acts of sabotage become rare victories overshadowed by brutal reprisals. In this alternate world, the Cold War as we know it never emerges. The ideological battle between democracy and communism is replaced by a far more imbalanced global tension. A rivalry between the United States and a Europe unified under authoritarian rule. With Moscow fallen and the Soviet government exiled deep into Asia, the Soviet Union becomes a fractured and weakened entity. It no longer serves as a superpower capable of countering German expansion. Stalin retains control over remnants of loyal territory, but the USSR transforms into a state struggling for survival in the shadow of German dominance. Scientific progress follows a drastically different path. Without Britain's involvement, the Allied nuclear research programs stagnate. The brilliant minds who once contributed to the Manhattan Project are scattered, some captured, others coerced into supporting German ambitions. Germany exploits the scientific wealth of the continent, channeling resources into advanced weapons development, long-range rockets, and nuclear physics. By the late 1940s, it becomes increasingly clear that the first nuclear weapon the world will see may not come from the United States. Culturally, Europe undergoes a forced metamorphosis. Schools, universities, and press outlets are restructured to reflect German ideological doctrine. A generation grows up speaking German as a second language, learning a censored version of history where dissent is treason and obedience is virtue. Many European traditions fade or are absorbed into a broader authoritarian identity manufactured in Berlin. Art, literature, and science survive only if they align with the state's doctrine. By the early 1950s, the global landscape resembles a precarious multipolar world dominated by fear and strategic uncertainty. The United States, isolated across the Atlantic, carries the burden of defending democracy without the support of European allies. Latin America strengthens ties with Washington out of necessity, while parts of Asia and Africa grapple with the expanding influence of the Axis. The remnants of the Soviet government fight a desperate ideological war from beyond the Euro, but their messages struggle to reach a world now conditioned to accept German supremacy. This is a world where the Allied triumph that shaped our reality never arrived. A world where freedom flickers in isolated pockets, overshadowed by military empires that seemed unstoppable. In this rewritten history, Humanity enters an age defined not by cooperation and reconstruction, but by domination, intimidation, and the long shadow of a regime that successfully conquered an entire continent.